From the studios in beautiful Oceanport, New Jersey, welcome to the biggest and greatest podcast ever. I'm your host, Ray Kay. All right, we got a special treat today. This is a author, a New York Times best-selling author, Boston Globe, Christian Monitor, Parade, LA Times, books as diverse as Rescued, A Second Chance for Dogs, Rescue Road, another book, One Man, 30,000 Dogs, 1 Million Miles, The Unofficial Girl's Guide to New York, The Unofficial Mad Men Cookbook, as I like to say, as opposed to the official. Most people don't like official, so I like that unofficial. Peter Zheutlin is with me. Peter, I friended on Facebook, or he friended me. I think I requested it. Peter, let's get right into the law school to writing, that whole, I call it the revolution of getting into that. You could keep it kind of short, and then we'll get into your career.
Yeah, I think, every lawyer lurks a writer that wants to be. I graduated from law school, got off into the law firm world, found it kind of a grind. Eventually found my way into working in the nonprofit sector for an anti-nuclear organization back in the 80s. And while I was there, I started writing opinion pieces that started getting published in newspapers, and it was kind of a kick to do that. And that is really how the writing bug took hold. And I gradually worked my way up to writing books starting in about 2007.
So you left the legal world not when you were like 24. I mean, it sounded like you were in it for a little while before you entered the writing world.
I was still pretty young. I went off to work in the nonprofit world when I was in my early 30s and did that for about 10 years. And that was sort of the stepping stone to, doing what I think I always really wanted to do, which was to write. And I've been lucky to find some great things, things to write about, things I care passionately about. Some of the books have been more fun, like the Mad Men Cookbook, based on the television show. Some have been more serious, and it's a kind of life I like. It's a bit of a solitary life in some ways, but if you're a curious person, being a writer is a great thing to be.
Well, you got my attention with your last few books. You got one coming out too, which I love to talk about because this thing really sounds intriguing. The one that's coming out in September. Your fascination with dogs. I've always loved dogs myself, and the rescue dog thing is always intriguing. I'm kind of new to that world too, and it's always been sad to me, because I never like going in shelters. And I don't like watching those TV commercials with the dogs. What got you into those rescue animals?
Well, what happened was for the first 25 years of my marriage, my wife and then my kids, desperately wanted a dog. And I consistently refused. I grew up with a dog, but I just didn't want the responsibility while I was raising kids of taking care of one. It sounds kind of selfish, and maybe it was. But when my younger son was about a year away from going to college, the light switch just went on, and I finally agreed that we should get a dog. And I knew nothing about, we all refer to as rescue dogs. I didn't even know how to go about getting a dog. But when my wife suggested the idea, I was all on board because I'm kind of partial to underdogs in every walk of life. And, since there are hundreds of thousands of dogs languishing in shelters in this country that desperately need homes, it just seemed like the right thing to do. And so in 2012, we adopted our first rescue, who had been lucky to survive a high kill shelter in Louisiana before he came up to join us in Massachusetts. And what got me into writing books about it was that I didn't really understand why we were adopting a dog all the way from Louisiana. And my curiosity about why there were so many Southern dogs up here in the Northeast is what launched me into an exploration of the whole world of people who, selflessly do the painful work of walking through these shelters that you mentioned, to save as many dogs as they can. But it's heartbreaking work because they can't save them all. And you're right. It's, there's a lot of sadness in that world, but a lot of joy too for it. And I think the poignancy of my relationship with our dog, we actually now have 3, and they're all rescues from Louisiana.
Why Louisiana, Peter? Why? My neighbor, it was out of state. Why not like Massachusetts or New Jersey?
Well, it's really an issue of supply and demand.
Okay.
And I'll give you an example from New Jersey. there's one little parish down in Louisiana that the shelter there serves, maybe 50,000 people, and they euthanize about 4,000 dogs a year. And that's about 90% of the dogs that come in. In the entire state of New Jersey, with a population, in the millions, 57 times the population of this parish, they euthanize about the same number of dogs. And so we in the Northeast have, over many decades, gotten a handle on the overpopulation problem.
Okay.
But in the South, in many, it's not just Louisiana, but parts of the South, Tennessee's a big state for rescue dogs. Texas, there's just a huge number of these dogs, and a lot of people who want to adopt up north. So it's simply a supply and demand problem. There are no rescue dogs being adopted out of shelters in Vermont and going to Louisiana, for example. So you walk around, the Boston area where I live and meet people with dogs. 9 out of 10 will tell you, "Oh, my dog is a rescue from Alabama or Tennessee or Texas," and that's why.
Okay. Makes sense.
So I just really got curious about this whole phenomenon, and I wanted to explore the world of those people who make these adoptions possible. And they're remarkably giving people, who spend tons of money out of their own pockets often, who sacrifice a lot, who go through a lot of emotional fatigue because they see a lot of heartbreak and they see a lot of misery. But when you see people getting their dogs, when they get, come off these transports that come up from the South, it's just a magical moment. And these dogs seem to know something good has finally happened to them. And the relationship becomes more poignant because I look at our dogs and I know that if we hadn't stepped up for them, or if nobody had stepped up for them, I know the fate that awaited them. So it makes it a more poignant relationship, I think.
Is it, these dogs, well, first off, Peter, how does a dog become rescued? They just get abandoned, they get abused, they just get thrown on the street. You hear people drop dogs off.
All of the above. You can walk through parts of rural Louisiana and find litters of puppies alive that have been dropped in dumpsters. Some of them are picked up by animal control as strays. Some of them, for example, they may be a dog that was obtained for hunting and it's not a good hunter, so you just let it go. So there are a lot of strays, and then of course they aren't spayed and neutered, and they're living, out on their own. They reproduce, and before you know it, you've got a population problem that's spiraling out of control. Some animals are taken from hoarding situations. They're taken from dogfighting rings. They're simply abandoned in shopping center parking lots. You go down south and you see this problem up close. You almost, especially if you're from the Northeast, you can't really even wrap your head around what you'll see in terms of the way people relate to dogs. And I don't want to paint it with too broad a brush because the heroes of the rescue movement, many of them are Southerners themselves, but they'll tell you they're living with a lot of irresponsibility around them when it comes to people taking care of animals.
It's almost like you got the extremes. You got the most evil type of stuff. I always figure it's like an evil thing, dropping a dog off, or they tie the dog up and the dog's miserable in the backyard and they just don't treat it right, or to the other extreme, which is the ultimate thing. It seems the altruistic, loving type people. Salt of the earth type stuff.
You see it all, and look, this does happen everywhere. Animals are abused everywhere. But in this country, the overpopulation problem is, as a matter of fact, it's concentrated largely in certain swaths of the South. It's just the way it is.
Okay. The dog now is mostly abuse. It's suffering from the ultimate post-traumatic syndrome. Probably it's probably a name for it for dogs. You're taking a risk, I guess. Are you, Peter? You get this dog coming in.
I think Ray, that's actually a bit of a myth.
Okay.
There is, and I had these. Believe me, I had these same misconceptions when my wife first suggested a rescue dog. The notion that you're getting damaged goods.
Mm-hmm.
You're buying, you're buying into a lot of problems. 99% of the time, these adoptions work out beautifully. The dogs, dogs are very resilient. They really respond to love and affection. They may need, like any dog that comes into your home, wherever you get it, needs to adjust. And I would say that more than the dog needing to learn how to live with humans, it's up to the humans to learn how to live with the dog and have realistic expectations. Dogs are not little children. They don't speak English. They don't, you can't expect a dog to behave perfectly all the time. Some will have separation anxiety. Some of them may be fearful because of things that have happened to them in the past. But, dogs live very much in the moment, and they tend to adapt very quickly. So I don't think it is true that by adopting a rescue dog or a shelter dog, you're buying yourself a passel of problems. It's simply not the case. Can it be the case? Yes. It can also be the case when you get a dog from a breeder, even if it's a puppy. They're
Right.
individuals. They have, one dog may be an anxious dog. One dog may be completely chill. Ours are very different personalities, but, there are no guarantees wherever you go to get a dog. But love and patience and understanding go a long way. And most people who go this route will tell you their dog is just the most wonderful dog in the world, no matter what its background.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. Peter, what is it about dogs? I mean, they do seem kind of special over, say, cats or rabbits or, other kinds of pets. Can you put your finger on it?
Well, I think for the most part, is that dogs bring out the best in us. They make us more compassionate people because they give so much back. They're very expressive. Their love is unconditional. And what I referred to before, I think their ability to live in the moment is something that's very appealing to those of us, who are always worried about, paying the bills and, helping our kids through their troubles. And, when, the car needs repair, we've always got all these things on our mind. And I think many of us aspire to live more in the moment and to be more mindful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think dogs do that. Whenever you walk in the front door of your house and the dog greets you like you just liberated Paris after the war,
absolutely,
it's very rewarding. So I think we're able to form connections with dogs. Not that we can't with other animals, but I think dogs just, they just teach us to be better people. And I think we respond to that. And also I would say that our relationships with our dogs in some ways are much simpler than our human relationship. Who doesn't, argue with their spouse or have difficulties with their kids? And I always say to people, it's really easy in a relationship when only one of you can talk. So, it's that unconditional love, I think, that makes the relationship with a dog quite unique.
Well, I remember when I was 9, my first dog died, and I cried. People.
Oh, it's a huge.
Yeah,
listen, I hear stories, and in my book Rescued, I did a whole chapter on this, which I hadn't intended when I set out to write the book, probably because I wanted to avoid the subject. But I started to hear all these incredible stories from people who had lost a dog, and what a profound loss it was. And I don't think I really grasped that until we brought dogs into our lives. People really go through, and they shouldn't minimize it. It is a real loss. And I think when dogs become old and infirm and we face that awful decision, about whether it's their time, it's really that time when we have to really put our own interests and our own, desires aside and give ourselves over completely to the dog and do what's best for them. And, that's what I meant when I said that they make us more compassionate people. They bring out the best in us if we let them. But yeah, I've heard so many stories. I'll tell you just one very quickly. About a woman in upstate New York when their dog was near the end, and it was, I think, September, and their dog was a southern dog that had come up here and loved the snow, and they had an idea because it was clearly the dog was not going to make it to the next winter, and they called the hockey rink at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in upstate New York, and got the hockey rink to deliver a pile of ice shavings and snow for their dog to lie on in its final days. And that's what I mean about bringing out compassion, in us. It was such a touching story that this dog got to spend its final days doing what it loved the most, being in the snow. And I heard a lot of stories like that. And, it's a real loss. It's a real loss, and people shouldn't minimize it.
If you don't mind me asking, how do they? Like you hear, they're going to put the dog to sleep. Is it a needle thing, or is it a painless situation?
I mean, usually it's an injection, a heavy sedative. Now that's in a veterinarian's office. If we flip back and go back to these shelters we were talking about, where huge numbers of dogs are euthanized, it's not always so pleasant. I don't want to, we don't have to go into the details.
Okay.
No, it can be, there are ways to ease this passage, that doesn't, that's not painful, not physically painful, but clearly, emotionally painful. And, a lot of, I read somewhere that if you don't, when that moment comes, and I don't want to make this too much of a downer, stay with your dog, be with your dog. They've been there for you, and you need to be there for them right to the end.
Just stay with the dog. Right.
But again, I don't want to make this too heavy, because the point is that there's so much joy in this relationship for years, and, in the back of your mind, you may dread this moment, but it's not a reason to avoid engaging in this relationship to begin with. I mean, this is, part of life, is loss and grief. And it's true when we have animals in our lives too. But I've gotten so much joy out of, one and then two, and now we live with 3 rescue dogs, and it's a lot sometimes, but it's just a lot of fun too.
What's the one thing I'll mention Albie, so I want to talk about your upcoming book. What's the one thing that he gives you? Like, if you could say one thing that you
Albie is just such a gentle and sweet soul. He just makes my heart jump every day. I would describe him as sort of not always perfectly behaved dog, but the best intentioned dog. Dogs don't have malice. They don't formulate, evil plans. Every day is new for them. They don't think about what happened yesterday. They don't make plans for tomorrow. And Albie's just a sweet old soul now. And I just have enormous empathy for him, for where he came from, for what he must have gone through the first 3 years of his life. And, now I've seen the entire, the trajectory of his life, and he's about 10 now and kind of arthritic. He doesn't move that well anymore. And I have enormous compassion for this dog.
The picture, the photo, he looks like a good-looking dog. I see on your upcoming book, the dog went over the mountain. What a title that is, with the dog looking, with your dog, Albie, looking at the mountain. It's a nice-looking dog. It just looks like
He's a beautiful dog. Yeah, he's a golden retriever, yellow lab mix. That picture was taken, the cover photo on the new book was taken in Yosemite Valley. And we got there. I had decided when I was about 63 to reread a book I had read when I was a 15-year-old kid in New Jersey called Travels with Charlie. Many people have read it. It was a classic by John Steinbeck, one of the greatest American writers. And when Steinbeck was nearing the age of 60, he decided that he had lost touch with the country and took his dog Charlie on a cross-country trip in a camper for several months. And I read the book, and I was about Steinbeck's age, a little older, Steinbeck's age when he wrote the book back in the 60s. And I said, I think this would be a great idea. And so almost a year ago today, Albie and I took off in a little red convertible to drive 9,200 miles to the West Coast and back. And the title of the book, The Dog Went Over the Mountain, really is a reference to that old children's song about the bear went over the mountain just to see what it could see. That was the concept. There was no big agenda to the trip. There was no, let's figure out what's happening in America today with President Trump. It was just, let's go on this trip and, rediscover the country we live in and see who we meet and, take in the sights.
What did you learn? What did you learn on the trip?
Oh, I mean, some of the things.
Some of the things. Give me three or four.
Let me give you one example about what I learned about traveling with a dog. We were in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was getting late at night. I had to decide whether Albie needed to go out one more time, to go to the bathroom. And I was kind of tired. I said, should we or shouldn't we? And I said, yeah, we should go out one more time. And where we were staying, you could look right across at the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that run up one side of Santa Fe. And I went out and it was it's the faintest idea that there was a light, some kind of light behind the mountains. And I thought, I wonder if that's the moon is going to rise over the mountains. And we waited, and sure enough, it got brighter and brighter. And then we watched this beautiful moonrise. It was a full moon over the mountains at night in New Mexico. And it was so glorious. And I'm sitting there thinking about, the cosmos and the way the universe works and how the moon comes into our view and what a miracle it is. And I looked over and Albie is facing in the completely opposite direction because, to him, this is a non-event. I mean, whether the moon comes up and he doesn't have the knowledge to understand what makes it so miraculous in the sense that I was appreciating it. What I kind of realized is that we were on different trips together, basically.
Right.
And the things that I could appreciate were not necessarily the things that he appreciated. He liked being in the outdoors and he lives more through his nose than his eyes, obviously, as a dog. But I realized that we were not going to sit down in a month or a year or 2 years and say, hey, Albie, remember that night we saw this beautiful moonrise in New Mexico? He wasn't going to remember that. And nor did he even appreciate it when it happened. Not that he wasn't a joy to travel with, he was, but it made me kind of realize that, we all have limitations of different kinds. And he wasn't going to be able to appreciate the trip in a visual sense the way I could.
Right.
But I couldn't appreciate the trip in an olfactory sense, probably to the degree that he was able to. The lesson I think I learned about the country and people in general is that these are very fractious times. Everybody seems to be at each other's throat. But when you meet people on the ground, one-on-one, or we were in a lot of small towns, what you find is that people really just want to be helpful. And it's much easier to have a conversation face-to-face with someone, even about things you disagree with, than the kind of, what we see on
behind the keyboard
on Facebook. And I'm, and I confess I'm one of them. And I'll just give you an example. I had stopped on a rainy day in Bismarck, North Dakota to get a cup of coffee at Starbucks. And I left Albie in the car. There was a bicycle in the parking lot hooked up to one of these kiddie trailers, stuffed with gear. It was obviously somebody who was on a long distance trip. And I went into Starbucks and I sat down and I didn't see anyone that looked like they were connected to this bike. But then this guy comes out of the men's room and he's big, broad shoulders, 6 feet tall, tough looking guy. And he sits down next to me and I kind of said, is that your bike? And that led us into a long conversation. He was a former Marine, about my age. And he and I have absolutely polar opposite visions of this country. But we had a perfectly amiable and enjoyable talk over about an hour. And we emailed afterwards. I left him with a copy of one of my books to take with him and to read along the way. If I had met him on Facebook, we would have been at it hammer and tongs, but I was eager to just listen and hear what he had to say. And I just found that wherever we were, people were hospitable. People in small towns, they've seen a lot of hardship, like Okima, Oklahoma, Woody Guthrie's hometown, which is why I went there. I wanted to see it. And it's a very conservative place politically, and I'm very liberal politically. People were so grateful that I took the time to stop, and I was curious about their town, and I knew about Woody Guthrie, and I was invited to a class of 1970 high school picnic that night. It was just,
wow.
People were just really welcoming and kind, and I think we need to kind of try and draw on that more in our lives, especially now that we seem so divided.
So on the ground, if you turn off your TV and turn off your Facebook, if you just go on the ground and do a trip, you probably wouldn't even notice anything. You're just normal people just talking. All right, you got a little different, but it's friendly, and you're curious about each other's lives. So on the ground,
and I'll tell you another thing, Ray. There were parts of the rural South where I didn't feel entirely comfortable, and I tried to examine why that was the case. And I'm of the generation whose visions of the South were formed by some really traumatic events. There was, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the murder of 3 young student civil rights workers in the 60s that came from the North. One was black, 2 were Jewish, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. The assassination of Medgar Evers, George Wallace blocking the entrance to the University of Alabama. These were events that sort of formed my early visions of the South. And so I realized that when we travel, we pack our bags, but we also pack our biases and our preconceptions. And so we passed through small towns in the South where I was uncomfortable because, there were so many Confederate flags and a lot of overt religious messaging that was not, a little bit, made me a little bit uncomfortable. But we had no trouble anywhere. But I just, it just made me think about the things that, what has formed my impressions of certain parts of the world. And are those preconceptions fair? I think in some cases they are, and probably in some cases they're overdrawn. And I don't know. And it might be different, for example, if I were African American traveling through some of these places. I don't know.
Right.
But I just tried to be a little bit more aware of how my own experience, my own biases sort of traveled with me wherever I went.
How long was the trip? I'm guessing 3 months to travel across and back.
No, it was less than that. We, being married and having other dogs at home, I thought I was pretty lucky to be able to get away for 6 weeks, which is what we did. We averaged about 200 miles a day, which meant that, we could, but it meant we could, it was like driving from Boston to New York. You could do it in the morning, and the idea was to sort of have the rest of the day free. And some places we lingered longer than others. I did find, as Steinbeck did when he traveled, towards the end of the trip, the urge, the lure of home got stronger, and we would cover more ground more quickly. But we tried to, we stayed sometimes with people we knew, but most of the time we were staying in dog-friendly accommodations. Felt like we were on the lam sometimes, moving around the way we were. But Albie was a trooper, and he opened conversations that I probably never would have had otherwise.
Yes. Okay. I see that.
He's the passport, right? Because everybody is drawn to a winsome looking dog. Kids always wanted to pet him. There were a lot of tourists from Asia, for example, in Yosemite and Grand Canyon, that wanted to have their pictures taken with him. And
he's like a star, right? He's
a magnet.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I think he made me more approachable, and there was just a lot of conversations that started with people asking me about Albie. And that's what Steinbeck experienced too. He wrote in Travels with Charlie that he said, any number of conversations began with, what manner of dog is that? People always have the same questions. What kind of dog is it? How old is he, and what's his name? And
universal questions, right?
Right, and that's how many of our interactions on this trip started. And so we were gone in 6 weeks, and I came back. I think I had sort of hoped that some of Albie's, the fact that Albie doesn't contemplate his mortality the way I do would rub off on me now that I'm, my mid-60s. That didn't happen. But what did happen is I did really come home, I think, with a greater appreciation for the everyday things that we take for granted, for the beauty of New England, frankly, which, I wears thin on me in the winter, but, it really, America's so much of it's so beautiful, and so much of it is so plain.
Right.
And
the Ray Charles version of America,
Yeah. I mean, it was, the other thing I'll tell you, when you drive around the country, is you see where almost all your food comes from. You drive across the panhandle of Texas and see these enormous cattle operations, or you drive through eastern Oregon and vast onion fields, and of course up the Central Valley of California, where all your fruits and nuts and a lot of your vegetables come from, and then get to the coast of Maine, where a lot of your seafood comes. You really kind of see where a lot of your food comes from.
It's like firsthand education, so many things.
Yeah. And, you on the one hand, the country seems vast in a way. And on the other hand, one driver and a dog can drive across it in a week.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Right. So it's not that big if you could do it in a week.
Right. You can do it.
Right.
But it's, it's very different in different places. There's no doubt about it.
Did you take a lot of pictures? Did you take a lot of pictures?
Yeah, I mean, I with my phone. I mean, as we all do. I try not to. I try to experience what's in front of me rather than always being behind. I used to travel with a camera, and I realized a lot of the times I wasn't really appreciating the moment. I was always trying to get the picture. So yeah, and the book will have, I think, there are going to be 16 pages of pictures from the trip, some of the characters that we met, and we did meet some incredible characters.
I bet
along the way, and some of the places.
You were saying I find, before I cut you off on that, on the pictures. You said I find. I think I lost your train of thought on that. I was curious where that was going.
Oh no, I said I find that if you are always behind a camera, you're not appreciating what's in front of you. I got you. Right. So I tried not to live behind the camera. Yeah, we took a number, and I was always trying to get pictures of Albie in the right certain places. Like I got a picture of Albie standing on a corner in Winslow, Arizona, which of course you have to do if you go through Winslow.
Why do you have to do it going through there?
Oh, the song, right? Taking it easy. Stand on the corner.
Yeah. Now okay.
Yeah. So I had to do that.
That's cool. I like that. That's stuff I do. Yeah.
So and some of the places are just so unbelievably grand. I've always thought that the Grand Canyon, for example, is one of the few places in the world that truly can't be appreciated in a photograph. And I hadn't been there in decades, and the day we arrived, the canyon was completely socked in with fog. It had snowed, and we couldn't see anything. I was so disappointed, and I told Albie we were going to just wait. And sure enough, that afternoon it started, there were breaks in the clouds, and it started to clear, and all of a sudden, the magnificence of the Grand Canyon, which is on a scale that's really hard to appreciate.
I've never seen it. Does it take your breath away?
Yeah, I mean, it's.
Does it literally take your breath away?
Literally hard to fathom. You can look at pictures all day, but even when it was totally fogged in, there's a sense, even standing on the edge of the canyon, of something vast, in your presence. It's more than a mile deep, and it's about 10 miles across. And even those statistics don't convey the grandeur of it. Some places just have to be seen to be appreciated.
Outside of that, what was another impressive place besides the Grand Canyon?
Well, I've been there before as well. I mean, the picture on the cover is Yosemite Valley, and
just for the listeners, like places where they could go, that would be a place to go, Yosemite?
Yeah, I think so. Of course, these are, popular places even off season. Our national parks are under incredible pressure because they're so crowded. I'd say one of the great surprises, maybe not a total surprise, but I drove, we tried to stay off the interstate because, interstates are interstates, and wherever possible, we were on secondary roads. But we drove US 20 across Idaho, and Idaho is absolutely spectacular. And, there are other places I think that maybe aren't necessarily on people's radar screens, like the northeast corner of California, which is, not a place people think to go when you plan a vacation to California. You want to drive the Pacific Coast Highway, or, go to San Diego or Disney World or the national parks. But the northeast, I call it the quiet corner of California, is absolutely magnificent and untraveled. Magnificent forests and snow-capped mountains, and it's just not on the beaten path. In terms of cities, I had never been to Boise, Idaho before. It's a very cool, hip city. It's kind of like a small, maybe a slightly smaller version of Portland,
That's
Oregon.
what I was going to say, Portland. Okay.
Yeah. It's kind of like, reminded me a bit of Portland. That was a kind of pleasant surprise. But even, I mentioned Okima, Oklahoma before. A place that's on nobody's destination list unless you're, complete
unless your
Woody
grandfather
Guthrie
lives
freak.
there or something.
Well, it's just, it's not a beautiful place, but it's a friendly place, and I think it's a place, of warm people. That I just really had a great day there.
Wow. Okay.
And met some really interesting people, very kind, welcoming people there, and so that was a really nice surprise as well.
Do you find when you're traveling, Peter, you could be like even more yourself? Because, I used to go to Ireland a lot, and then I just felt in a way freer, because it's like no one really knows you, and you could there's no preconceptions of how you're supposed to be. Did you get that?
I mean, there's the anonymity of traveling can sometimes be a little unnerving, I would say. When you find yourself in a place where, like the saying goes, nobody knows your name.
Right.
Nobody knows your background, where you're from. We were in a town called Tehachapi, California, and this guy struck up a conversation with us. We were sitting down to have something to eat. And he's actually it turns out he's from Egypt, and he's a pharmacist, and he's been living in this town for 3 months. He's a young guy. He got his first job there. He went to pharmacy school in Los Angeles. And I was thinking, for us, we're just passing through and nobody knows us, but he's living there, and there's not a person there that knew him more than 3 months before. And it got me thinking a lot about what does it mean to be home? Where is home? It's usually the place where people know you. And I thought how isolating, if it was isolating for us in a sense to be somewhere where nobody knew us, imagine being from another country and trying to make your way, never seeing anybody you've seen 3 months before. Sometimes being in strange motels with Albie at night was sometimes a little unnerving and frankly lonely at times. But that was part of the reason I took the trip, was to shake things up a little bit, to make the days different. We fall into these rhythms at home. We do different things, but the days are, kind of repetitive in certain ways. And it was kind of...
you had to shake it up a little bit, right?
Shake it up, see what happens, feel uncomfortable. It's okay, to sometimes feel uncomfortable and far away and in a strange place. That's okay. It does you good.
Oh yeah. Little fun. I guess I'll go a little. I'll call it fun stuff. Who was your favorite author? You mentioned Steinbeck. Was that your idol, or?
Yeah. Well, I would say he wrote two of my. I would say I have three favorite American novels, and he wrote two of them: Grapes of Wrath and East of Eden. The third one I would put on that list is William Styron's book, The Confessions of Nat Turner, which is about a runaway slave. One of my favorite writers is Bill Bryson, who's written many books, and one of which also kind of inspired this travel book. He's written many travel books, but he wrote a book called The Lost Continent, Travels Around America, many years ago. And he's he wrote his most famous book is probably A Walk in the Woods, Hiking the Appalachian Trail. He's a brilliantly funny writer. So, when I'm looking for, and he's also written some serious books, but I'd say I think I've read everything Bill Bryson has written. Trying to think of more contemporary books. Of recent books, I've really admired these two books by Amor Towles. Many book clubs are reading them. The Rules of Civility and A Gentleman in Moscow. I think are both great books. So, I'm in a book group, like many people are at this age, and we read fiction and nonfiction. I tend to read a lot of politics and biography as well.
What advice would you give to young writers? Someone that wants to get into it. Is there advice?
Yeah, well, if you're looking, it depends on whether you're talking to somebody who really wants to try and make it a career. I don't think there's anyone who would recommend it as a surefire way to make a good living.
Mm-hmm. But you have made a living of it, though, correct?
Well, I would say.
Or do you have other jobs?
It's been a bit of a sideline. I've also done, I do, work for hire as well. I couldn't survive on what I've,
writing a book every year or whatever. Okay.
But I do think I think writing is becoming a lost art. I taught legal research and writing at law schools years ago, and I think a lot of kids come out of college and they don't write. And I think one of the reasons they don't write and they don't write well is because they don't read. My own kids, I hate to say it, are not big readers. And I think, as technology has given them so many other things to do and to capture their attention, I think we've got a generation where finding serious readers is much harder. And I think it's very hard to be a good writer if you're not an avid reader. So one piece of advice would be to read.
Is the education system to blame for any of this, or not really? People should just read.
That's above my pay grade to place blame. But I do think that the evolution over a very short period of time, or the revolution in media in our lifetimes, has been so dramatic that the way people get information has been completely transformed. And so I think reading is becoming a little bit, it's just rare to see people sitting in a coffee shop with a book as opposed to a laptop. And not that you can't read books on devices, on these devices, but I don't think most people are spending their time reading. They're spending more time on social media. I don't think that's...
And it's too bad because you could learn so much too about life. And everything.
I just think, writing is a real craft and it takes a lot of practice. And, but I do think that what stops people is they kind of want to lay down, it's like they want to paint the perfect picture the first time. Mm-hmm. They want the first draft to come out right. You have to be willing to just sort of get it out there. I always say to people, what's your process? It's kind of an odd question. I don't really have a process. I sit down and I poke away at a keyboard.
You just start.
You just start, and you know that the way it's coming out the first time is not necessarily going to be the way you want it to come out. But it's like a sculptor. You start with a lump of clay and you whittle away at it until you find what you want underneath. And I think writing's the same way. You got to get that lump of clay out there on your laptop. Just get it out there. Everything you think you want to say, and don't worry if it's crafted beautifully. You can go back and work on detail and work on crafting it. But I think most people get tripped up right at the starting line, because they're not willing to do that, to take that leap and just say, okay, it's not going to be great, but I'm going to just get what I have to say out there on paper. Mm-hmm. And then you can work on that. Right. That would be my, my advice.
Well, you're the real deal. So that sounds like great advice, to me.
I hope so.
Peter, this is my fun. Well, it's a fun section, I call it, but it's the most difficult. I call it hit and miss. I'm going to do a little word association. You could mention the first one or two or three words or sentence that comes to your mind. When I do this. I mean, this is how I really get to know my guests. During this section.
This is a Rorschach test.
Okay. Are you all right with this or what?
I
couple minutes.
I'm going to try.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. This is my little wrap up section, but it's not easy, but we'll go for it. Favorite color?
Blue.
Okay. If you were on a deserted island and you had to pick 2 CDs or records, what would they be?
One would definitely be some James Taylor CD for sure, because I've listened to James Taylor nearly every day of my life for 50 years. What would the second one be? It would probably be a mixed list of some of my favorite stuff. I don't know. James Taylor for sure. Maybe probably Pete Seeger, the folk singer, because he was a big part of my life growing up, musically. My parents were listening to him when I was a kid, and I kind of grew up on Pete Seeger's, traditional American folk music.
Okay. If you were in a foxhole, other than a family member or a dog, I'll call it, other than those, who would be in it with you?
It would not be you, Ray, because you'd be asking me these questions.
No, you wouldn't want me in it. No. I drive you nuts with the questions. Yeah.
Oh, probably my brother.
Okay. Favorite actor?
Favorite actor? Wow. I love Robert Duvall. I'll leave it. Robert Duvall.
Favorite movie?
This is going to sound corny. I don't have one, but I did love Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner and James Earl Jones.
Okay. I like that one a lot myself. Favorite book? One book. What's the best book?
Well, I named 3 earlier.
Which one? Out of those 3 or a new one? What's one book?
Yeah, I'll pick from that.
If you're on an island, what book would you bring? How's that?
If I was on an island, what book would I bring? Not something I wrote, that's for sure.
And other than the Bible,
probably the Grapes of Wrath. I mentioned it earlier, but I think that book, the humanity in that book is so extraordinary. And
I'm going to have to get it. I'm going to have to get it now.
Steinbeck wrote. He wrote about the underdogs and marginalized people, and these people heading west in the Dust Bowl, who gave everything they had to others, when they had so little themselves. And so I think that's a great lesson. So I'd say the Grapes of Wrath.
Okay. Lennon or McCartney?
McCartney.
Greatest U.S. president of all time?
Lincoln.
Montreal Expos. This is hard. This is hard stuff. I'm getting to the hard stuff now.
Yeah. Rusty Staub, who was later traded to the Mets.
Most impressive person you've ever met?
Most impressive person I've ever met.
Then I got one more, and then we're done.
Well, they're in different. People are impressive for different reasons. For a very personal reason, in terms of, I don't want to go into. I would say James Taylor.
Okay. Well, along those lines, who was the most famous person you ever met?
Well, Crosby, Stills, and Nash. I know I've met all of them. James Taylor, of course, probably the most famous. I would say probably James Taylor is probably the most famous person.
Were you disappointed in any of the Crosby, Stills, and Nash crew, or did they?
Very different men. I mean, I've. It's a long story, and I helped. They did a benefit concert for an organization I used to work for, so I actually spent some time with each of them. The one I have seen the most often, I mean, not that he's a friend, but I've encountered him several times, is Graham Nash, who's a very fine person.
They got a great catalog, I'll tell you that.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Tony Orlando.
Don, who else?
Okay, that's good. Peter Zheutlin, I'm Ray K. That was Peter Zheutlin. Thank you, Peter. I appreciate that. That was a tremendous hour. It went fast. I think it could have been a few more hours, but maybe we'll have you back again. Maybe when your next book comes out, if you could come back on. I'd love it to happen.
Sure thing, Ray.
Okay.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. We'll catch you later.
Take care. Bye-bye.